Hello and welcome to my Yu-Gi-Oh channel. Today we're going to be looking at a brand new pack which has come out of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. It's called the King of Vermillion. It's one of the new mini boxes and we'll be looking at the ultra rares. Blackwing Armor Master is a Dark Attribute Winged Beast type synchro monster. It's a level 7 with 2500 attack and 1500 defense. It requires one Blackwing Tuner monster and one or more non-tuner monsters to summon it. And the effect is, it cannot be destroyed by battle, and you take no battle damage from attacks involving this card. At the end of the damage step, if this card attacked a monster, you can place one wedge counter on that monster, maximum 1. You can remove all wedge counters from your opponent's monsters. The attack and defense of those monsters that had wedge counters become 0 until the end of this turn. I'm quite surprised that it's taken this long for Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links to have this featured. I mean, it is one of the original synchro monsters that was used by Crow in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. We've had much more of their Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 support when they went to the synchro dimension than we have of some of the original cards. And I think this is one of the more iconic ones. The ability to not be destroyed in battle is a decent enough effect, and actually to take no damage from that means you can actually crash into monsters and not have to fear of anything, well, except for if that monster has a card effect which destroys by that effect. The other thing is, if you don't happen to defeat that monster in battle, you leave one of these wedge counters, which means on the very next turn you can just remove that wedge counter and then make that monster's attack points 0 out, and then just beat over it. So at some stage you will be able to get over any of your opponent's monsters. It might be a 2-turn strategy, but it's very easy to manipulate and to deal with. I mean, just look at things like Gale, the Whirlwind, and any of the level 4 monsters. Some of them can special summon themselves really easily to come into a level 7 monster. So meeting even the summoning conditions you could probably just do purely from special summoning. Red Nova Dragon is a Dark Attribute Dragon type synchro monster. It's a level 12 with 3500 attack and 3000 defense. And it requires 2 tuner monsters and 1 Red Dragon Archfiend to summon it. And its effect is, this card gains 500 attack for each tuner monster in your graveyard. It cannot be destroyed by an opponent's card effects. When an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can target the attacking monster, banish this card, and if you do, negate that attack. During the next end phase, special summon this card, banished by this effect. Right, this is one of 2 monsters that's been swarming Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links and the meta for the last couple of weeks. The other one being Shooting Star Dragon. Mostly because they're very dominantly powerful synchro monsters, and actually summoning them isn't particularly difficult. Within the Jack Atlas deck, there are multiple ways of doing this, considering Red Dragon Archfiend is his main go-to monster, and the Red Resonator and the various other Resonators are able to kind of special summon themselves, or to get themselves in a position where they can actually end up on the field really quickly. I mean, all you need is either a level 1 and a level 3 tuner, or 2 level 2 tuners, which all of the Resonator monsters can achieve. They even have search cards specifically for the Resonator series, so if you need a particular one, you can actually get that one and then summon it. Even some of his newer support has been really easy to get Red Dragon Archfiend onto the field. This card actually came out in response to, it was in the duel against Team Ragnarok, because they had the Nordic gods. He faced against, it wasn't Broder, it was the other one who had Thor, who is a 3500 attack synchro monster. And this was the response. Jack needed to find a stronger form of the synchro summoning to be able to defeat it. It was actually featured within Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds in the Japanese version, because there was a side arc that looked into defeating this devil creature, also referred to as Red Nova, which seems to have fused with Red Dragon Archfiend, but they never actually introduced that within the English dubbed. I think it's mostly because of the angel and devil connotations. They really like to stay away from that type of stuff within any Western anime series. It's just one of those taboo subjects. The ability it has, initially it will start off with at least 4500 attack points. Actually, scratch that, it's probably more likely to start off with at least 5000. Because you will need the tuner monster necessary to synchro summon into Red Dragon Archfiend, plus the 2 tuners to synchro summon that Red Dragon Archfiend to become this card. So it's usually at least 5,000 attack points to begin with, and the more tuners you use, or the more you kind of scrap them to the graveyard, the stronger it becomes. It gets to that point where none of your opponent's monsters will ever really be able to reach this pinnacle. The other thing you've got to think of is this card cannot be destroyed by an opponent's card effect, which is a bit of a nightmare because you've got things like Sakuretsu Armor, which are specifically designed to destroy. You've got Raigeki Break, and there are so many ways you would want to just destroy this card. And the other nuisance is, of course, you can't even get rid of this card really by battle. Every time you try and attack into this card, you can just shut down your opponent by banishing this card and negating that effect. The issue I would have with that is that it does leave the field. So if you've got multiple other monsters that you can actually summon and then OTK your opponent, this card will never come back. It has to come back at the end phase specifically. It's not that it can dodge something and then come back instantly. That's one of the biggest downsides. Other than having a little bit of heavy investment, it has to be a very specific deck you're trying to run in order to meet these requirements. It's also susceptible to certain other cards, for example, Dimensional Prison, and you've also got Karma Cut. There's also a Valkyrie card, which actually turns your Valkyrie from attack mode to defense mode, and it can banish one of your opponent's monsters. I'm sure there are other examples as well. There's Dark Core, which you discard one card, you banish one of your opponent's face-up monsters, and there are ways and outs to this card. They just don't tend to be run that heavily. My advice would be just forget about siding these cards. You absolutely need them in the main deck if this is going to continue running at the pace it already is. And the final ultra rare is Tech Genus Wonder Magician. This is light attribute spellcaster type Synchro Tuner, which is level 5 with 1900 attack and 0 defense. And it requires 1 tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner Tech Genus monsters. If this card is synchro summoned, you can target one spell or trap card on the field and to destroy that target. If this card on the field is destroyed, draw 1 card. Once per chain during your opponent's main phase, you can, as a quick effect immediately after this effect resolves, synchro summon using this card you control. This is something that was used by Antinomy, who was one of the characters who helped Zero, who was one of the main villains. But he was using it as a means of trying to encourage Yusei and to power him up. This was the person who taught Yusei how to excel synchro. And he did that by using this card alongside another level 5, I think it was Tech Genus Power Gladiator, and then goes into Buster Blader, which is the level 10 excel synchro form. It's a decent enough card because it's not difficult to summon. A lot of your monsters are able to kind of special summon themselves and then go into an instant synchro of this card. This is able to instantly destroy a spell or trap card, whether it be one of your own or one of your opponents. And of course, when it's destroyed or when it leaves the field, you are able to replace it by drawing a new card, which is always a decent advantage. Out of the 3 cards, my favourite is probably Armoured Master, just because it has the ability to out any of these other 2 cards. Of course, it's susceptible to card effect destruction, but being able to leave these wedge counters means you're able to rip your opponent's attack points to 0 and probably OTK within the next turn. I don't really have any problems with any of the other cards. I just think that Red Nova Dragon is a little bit more difficult to summon, and it has to be in a very niche style of deck, whereas the other 2 are a little bit more flexible and they need less consistent means of summoning them. Going to be looking at the secret rares within the brand new mini box for Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, the King of Vermillion. Ally of Justice Catastor is a dark attribute machine type synchro monster. It's level 5 with 2200 attack and 1200 defense. It requires 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuner monsters. And the effect is, at the start of the damage step, if this card battles a face-up non-dark monster, destroy that monster. The best thing about this card is that happens at the start of the damage step. That means the second you go into your attack declaration, you can instantly destroy your opponent's monster, if it happens to be a non-dark. This pairs well with a continuous trap card called DNA Transplant, where you can make everything on the field a certain attribute. So if you just have the 2 card combo, you can instantly make everything, say for example, a light attribute, and therefore you can constantly guarantee that this card's effect is going to work. And remember, it's not just when this card battles, but when something battles into this. So if one of your opponents is attacking into this with a non-dart monster, the same effect applies. Armory Arm is a light attribute machine type synchro monster. It's level 4 with 1800 attack and 1200 defense. It requires 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuner monsters. And its effect is, once per turn, you can either target one monster on the field, equip this card to that target, or unequip this card and special summon it in attack position. While equipped by this effect, that target gains 1000 attack. If that target destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of the destroyed monster in the graveyard. I love this card, and it is very underestimated for what it can do. Firstly, it's an equip card, basically in a synchro monster. It gives 1000 attack points. You might be saying, okay, what's so significant about that? But it can make the difference between a lot of different monsters, and it can equip to basically anything. It doesn't have to be a specific type of monster, it doesn't have to be a synchro monster, it doesn't have to be an Xyz monster, it can be anything you wish. So long as it can be equipped, that's fine. The better part of the effect is actually its secondary ability to be able to inflict lots of burn damage. This, on top of any monster's physical attack points, can be enough to either OTK or to put yourself in a position where your opponent has very few life points. I think this was used in the anime by Yusei in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, and it was paired with his Nitro Warrior. Nitro Warrior has the ability where if it attacks a monster, it's able to then switch a monster from defense mode into attack mode and then go into another attack. It also benefits that if a spell card was used in the turn, it gains another 1000 attack points. So you imagine if you paired Nitro Warrior with this card, the amount of initial damage from battle damage that you can do, plus the burn effect damage from this might be enough to instantly destroy your opponent. The other thing is, there was another card which was called Junk Barrage, which does basically the same thing as this card does, an equip spell, but it does half the amount of damage based on the monster that you destroy. So total up all of that damage, you've gotten very easy OTK. Tuning is a normal spell card with the effect, add one Synchron tuner from your deck to your hand, then send the top card of your deck to the graveyard. This is a particularly powerful card to be used within Yusei's deck. Most of his monsters have some kind of recovering effect. I think he paired this a lot with his Junk Synchron, because when a monster was already in the graveyard, he could basically summon Junk Synchron, and then if it was level 2 or lower, he could just special summon through Junk Synchron's effect. So he usually would go into his Armory Arm or mostly Junk Warrior by this. This effect is actually slightly different from the anime effect. I think it was a case of, depending on the Synchron tuner that you actually added to the hand, you had to send that many cards times its level. So for Junk Synchron, that would be, since it's a level 3, you'd actually send 3 cards, but I think they thought this effect was a bit too broken, and at least there is the chance that you might not mill the correct card off the top of your deck to benefit from this effect, so they wanted to kind of balance the card out a little bit more. But even so, even if you're not going for this type of play, always being able to search for things like Quick Draw Synchron, that's a level 5 that can actually special summon itself from the hand by discarding a card, and usually you discard something like Quillbot Hedgehog, is always a good way, because then you can go into a level 7 Synchro monster. Mechlord Emperor Weisel is a Dark Attribute Machine type level 1 with 2500 attack and 2500 defense. And its effect is, it cannot be normal summoned or set, it must be special summoned by its own effect. When a face-up monster you control is destroyed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. Other monsters you control cannot declare an attack. Once per turn, you can target one synchro monster your opponent controls, equip that target to this card. This card gains attack equal to the combined attack of the monster equipped to it by this effect. Once per turn, when your opponent activates a spell card as a quick effect, you can negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. So this is one of the 3 Emperor monsters, well, the Machine Emperor monsters that were used by the Emperors of Iliasta. So you had 3 variations. This was kind of the mid-range one. You had Skeel, which had 2200 attack. You had Weisel at 2500, and you had Grinnell, who was equivalent to half of your opponent's life points when it was summoned. So at a push, you could get it to about 4000 attack points. That's why it was kind of deemed the most powerful of the 3 boss monsters. This is quite an unusual summoning condition. it has to rely on something being destroyed by a card effect, so you can actually trigger it yourself. There are some support cards that let you do this, so it's not as difficult as you may think it is. It being a level 1 with those stat lineup is very bizarre as well. Typically, to meet these types of conditions, you have to have some very obscure cards and some usually very specific cards to be able to actually meet any of these conditions. So in that respect, it's not too difficult to summon, and you're getting a very decent body monster onto the field with relatively little consequences. The thing about it being able to steal synchro monsters is neither here nor there. Whilst it's a good ability to have, and it's actually very useful against certain decks, especially those including Yusei and Jax, which are currently running around in the Duel Links meta. There will be a point where that might be kind of forgotten about and people won't be siding those cards in. That's why I don't think this is necessarily that great as a target, especially if your opponents are using Exceeds monsters or Fusion monsters. This card just becomes a 2500 attack monster, which in itself is fine. But for me, my favourite part of the effect is the final part, which is negating once per turn an opponent's spell card. Now, a lot of duelists tend to use spell cards to help create situations or create advantages. If you're able to negate your opponent's first card, or whichever card you want to, that puts them in a difficult position because they might not have a follow-up play to that, and that might actually force them to go on the back foot and act defensively, in which case you might be able to win the duel from that. Even if you don't win, being able to shut down one of your opponent's immediate spell cards means they're always that one card less in terms of advantage. Resonator Call is a normal spell card with the effect add one Resonator monster from your deck to your hand. So this was the card that I mentioned before, which is similar to tuning, which helps Yusei out. Resonator Call helps Jack Atlas's deck out because it just adds a Resonator monster. It's a very simplistic effect and is very useful, especially when used with Red Resonator, which can special summon itself, or with another one. I think Chain Resonator is very good with it as well. Depending on your situation, you might be able to take advantage. And actually, even if you use just the typical Dark Resonator, it does have that once per turn protection from being destroyed in battle effect, which might be enough to protect your life points for that turn. Fortismo, the Mobile Fortress, is a field spell card with the effect once per turn you can special summon one Mechlord army monster from your hand. Now, similar to the Mechlord Emperors, the army versions are Skeel, Weisel, and Grinnell, and they all have attack stats to them. The most powerful of which is, I think, it's Weisel. I think that's got 1800 attack. Then you've got Grinnell at 1600, and you've got Skeel at 1200. But my concerns are the summoning effect of Grinnell is when it's normal summoned, not when it's special summoned. Therefore, if you do use this effect, you're not getting those additional effects that you might wish to use. So it's probably good for like a rank 4 Xyz play. Other than that, or spamming the board, it's not particularly useful. Old Entity Yugioh is a fire attribute pyro type synchro monster. It's a level 4 with 2200 attack and 200 defense. It requires one tuner monster and one non-tuner monsters. Its effect is, if this card is synchro summoned, you can return all rank 4 Xyz monsters on the field to the extra deck. If you fusion summon using this card as a fusion material, you can draw one card. An Xyz monster that was summoned using this card on the field as Xyz material gains this effect. If it is Xyz summoned, you can draw one card. So what this card does is it actually rips apart all rank 4 Xyz monsters on the field. So if your opponent is playing a Yuma style of deck where you'll have things like Utopia, Gaga Cowboy, and maybe Heroic Challenger Excalibur, I've seen some of those being run around in Yuma's deck as well, especially for the time being. That means you can actually send those cards without having too much of a cost. The attack stat on this card is okay. 2200 isn't bad for a level 4 synchro monster, and it's one of the only couple of synchro monsters that you have that are level 4. The ability to draw an additional card, I say, is neither here nor there. It's fine as an ability, but relatively speaking, it's a meh ability, really. You've got only slots available for up to 7 extra deck cards. There's definitely things you'd rather fill that in rather than this card. Yoko Tuner is an Earth Attribute Beast type tuner level 1 with 800 attack and 600 defense. Its effect, when this card is normal summoned, you can special summon one tuner from your hand or graveyard, but it has its effects negated. This is actually quite useful if you want to use it in comparison to summon Red Nova Dragon as an alternative option if you don't want to just build on the Resonator archetype. which is a sub-archetype of Jax. It's a decent enough monster. I mean, if you're trying to go into like a double synchro monster, that's fine, because then you're having the ability to adapt levels a little bit as well. Because if this is a level 1 and then you need a level 8 monster, then you can like 2-step it. My only concern is it's really weak, and there are better tuners already in the game, so I do feel this is one of those that is going to be forgotten very quickly. Stardust Wish is a continuous trap card with the effect: once per turn, if a Stardust synchro monster you control is tributed to activate its own effect, except during the damage step, you can target that monster, special summon it. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to this effect's activation. Monsters special summoned by this effect cannot be destroyed by battle while in attack position. Right, so this card is actually very useful for the Stardust archetype. Most of the Stardust monsters tend to use their effects to tribute themselves in a way where this can actually help to revive them. That's kind of one of the main weaknesses of Stardust Dragon, because if you can force your opponent to use Stardust's effect, you essentially leave your field open for attack. That means they won't be getting their Stardust Dragon back until the end phase of that turn, in which case, if your opponent already has the monsters ready to OTK you, you will never meet this condition. At least by having this card, you're able to bring back your Stardust Dragon. It becomes immune to certain, well, from battle destruction as well, even though you are taking battle damage if your opponent's monsters happen to be a little bit stronger. But also, they can't respond to the activation of this trap card, which means they can't instantly Mystical Space Typhoon or Cyclone or Cosmic Cyclone it. So you do have that level of protection that is necessary. And the final secret rare is Crimson Resonator. This is a Dark Attribute Fiend type tuner, level 2 with 800 attack and 300 defense. If you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. If the only other monster you control is exactly one Dark Dragon Synchro monster, you can special summon up to 2 Resonator monsters from your hand or deck, except Crimson Resonator. You can only use each effect of Crimson Resonator once per turn. You cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck, except Dark Dragon Synchro monsters, the turn you activate either of this card's effects. So the good thing about this card is, again, it's a Resonator monster. It's one of the more powerful ones. Similar to Red Resonator, it's there designed to special summon other monsters and put yourself in a position where you can get your Red Dragon Archfiend into your Red Nova Dragon. The flexibility comes actually from the ability to access the deck rather than just purely your hand or graveyard, as you can then bring out another level 2 tuner monster and then go into your Red Nova Dragon. It doesn't really have any limitations outside of it having to be within its own archetype. You can't really think of that many Dark Dragon Synchro monsters. I'm sure there's a few. There's like Void Ogre Dragon, probably a list of other cards. I think I actually have a list of monsters that actually meet this requirement that are level 8, which I will link in either in the description or a card up above. But other than that, you don't really have anything currently in Duel Links that can kind of splash with this card. It's a decent and essential part of his deck, and definitely something you want to be running. So what do you guys think of these cards? Is there anything in particular you enjoy? Is there anything that you think is a bit too weak? For me, personally, I do like the Crimson Resonator, and I do like the Resonators in general. I think they're necessary for the deck. I don't have anything that I particularly didn't like within the secret rares, maybe Yoko Tuner as an example. We're going to be looking at the rare cards found within Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, the King of Vermillion mini box. Morphtronic Magnon is an Earth Attribute Thunder type level 3 with 800 attack and 800 defense. Its effect is, while in attack position, if your opponent controls a face-up monster, this card can only select their highest attack monster as an attack target. While in defense position, your opponent cannot select another monster as an attack target. So the whole point of this card is it basically makes itself the focus of the attack when it's in defense mode, whereas in the attack position, your opponent has to go in with their highest attack monster. Relatively speaking, neither effect is particularly that useful, unless you happen to have 2 Magnons on the field at the same time in face-up defense mode. I think it would have been better if it had been both face-up attack position to be able to use that effect, because that way it's an attack loop. It prevents both monsters from being attacked at any point, shutting your opponent's ability to really go into their battle phase. But generally speaking, because it's not got decent enough stats, unless you've got forms of ways of protecting these cards, such as things, Power of the Guardian, anything like that, or things that stop attacks such as Threatening Roar, Negate Attack, Hallowed Life Barrier, Waboku, things like that, then it's not really worth running. Morphtronic Boomboxing is an Earth Attribute Machine type level 4 with 1200 attack and 400 defense. Its effect is, while in attack position, this card can attack twice during each battle phase. Once per turn while in defense position, when a face-up Morphtronic monster you control is targeted for an attack, you can negate the attack. So actually this is one of the more powerful and useful Morphtronic monsters. You can combine this with Power Tool C and D, I think that's the equipped spell card, which gives your Morphtronic or Power Tool dragons an additional 1000 attack points, and considering that it's able to attack twice with 2200 attacks for each, that means you can clear your opponent's monsters, and you can also attack directly. It doesn't have any restrictions on being only against monsters, so you have that flexibility. The defense position effect is useful as well if your opponent isn't able to spam the board, but considering they will probably try and get rid of this card or negate it in some way to stop it using that negate attack effect. Morphtronic Clocken is an Earth Attribute Machine type level 2 with 600 attack and 1100 defense, and its effect is, while in attack position, this card gains 500 attack for each morph counter on it. While in defense position, once per turn you can place one morph counter on this card. You contribute this card to inflict 1000 damage to your opponent for each morph counter on it. So this card is actually able to make itself quite powerful. Whilst in attack position, it just gains the attack stat for each morph counter on it, but to generate the counters themselves, you need to have this card in defense mode. This can be quite a long game because there are no other ways of adding morph counters. If there had been, then this would be a lot stronger. The burn effect damage is decent, but it is 500 points rather than 1000 because of the Duel Links rulings on burn effects doing half the damage they used to. But still, you can do a decent amount, maybe enough to defeat your opponent within a couple of turns, or at least boost this card up. Remember, 500 attack for each morph counter, so within a couple of turns it's a 1600 attack monster. If you leave it for a few more turns, it can come over 3000 if you leave it over something like 5 turns. But it is a big risk. It's all about balancing how long are you prepared to leave this in defense mode to make it subject to being a target, versus how long you want to generate before it becomes a beat stick in and of itself. Morphtronic Borden is an Earth Attribute Machine type level 3 with 500 attack and 1800 defense. While in attack position, Morphtronic monsters you control can attack your opponent directly. While in defense position, other Morphtronic monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle. I haven't seen many people play Morphtronics for the time being. I've not seen any people really playing Leo as a character, considering this is brand new support. But the whole point of having this card is if you have it in your first turn, and you've got it in defense mode, your opponent doesn't know what you're playing, and they attack into this with anything under 1800 attack points. Not only are they taking damage, but you've got this card face up, which means that you can protect your other Morphtronic monsters. The following turn, you will then try and put this card into attack position. If you've got equip cards, you'll try and equip certain cards to this card, or to some of your other cards, and then go in for the direct attacks, hopefully to reach enough damage to defeat your opponent within that turn. There are some cards that help within the archetype as well. I think Morphtronic Map, the field spell, helps to generate further attack points every time your Morphtronic monsters change battle mode, so you can do that. If you can do that over a few turns, you can generate enough attack points on these monsters to deal the finishing blow. Power Break is a normal trap card with the effect activate only while you control a face-up Power Tool Dragon. Select up to 3 equipped cards on your side of the field and or in your graveyard, and return them to the deck, and inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each card returned. This is a bit like Pot of Avarice, but for equipped spell cards. This is really decent considering that Power Tool Dragon lets you go through plenty of these equipped spells, so you do need a means of recovering them, especially since you're quite limited on your deck space. The burn effect damage is okay because it's 250 times the number of cards, so potentially that you could be doing 750 points of damage, which is just more the icing on the cake. It helps to reload your deck, and then it helps you to then use your Power Tool Dragon's effect maybe a couple more times. Mechlord Fortress is a field spell card with the effect neither player can target Mechlord Emperor monsters you control with synchro monster effects. When this card on the field is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can add one Mechlord Emperor monster from your deck to your hand. For a field spell, it's really quite weak. It's only specific to negating the effects of synchro monsters. I know that's the whole design around the Mechlord Emperors anyway, which is fine, but with all these other extra monsters you've already got, you've got Xyz monsters, you've got fusion monsters, you've got ritual monsters, and you've got so many ways of outing your opponent's Mechlord Emperors that this card is not that useful. Even when it's destroyed, the ability to search for a new Mechlord Emperor is nothing particularly special. I'm sure you could do these types of things with other cards, even if it's not archetype specific. Mechlord Army of Weisel is a Dark Attribute Machine type level 4 with 1800 attack and 0 defense. Its effect is gains 100 attack for each Mechlord monster on the field, except this card. Once per turn, when another Mechlord monster you control declares an attack on a defense position monster, you can activate this effect during that battle if it attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. So this is more just a beat stick monster. It does gain another additional 100 attack for each Mechlord on the field, so potentially it can be up to 2000 attack points, and it does grant one of your other Mechlord monsters the ability to do piercing damage once every turn. It's a fine effect, but it's still quite a forgettable card. It's necessary to run just from the point that the Mechlord cards, the Emperors, don't really have too many cards within their archetype, and to have some consistency, that's why you'd kind of run them. Mechlord Army of Steel is a Wind Attribute Machine type level 4 with 1200 attack and 1000 defense. Its effect is it gains 200 attack for each Mechlord monster on the field, except this card. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon one Mechlord Army monster from your deck. So very similar to how Weisel works, in that it gains a little bit of a boost for each other Mechlord monster you have on the field, which is fine. If you have two others, it becomes a 1600 attack monster, still slightly weaker than Weisel, and it can replace itself with another Mechlord Army monster. And the benefit is that's coming from the deck rather than the hand. It's fine because neither Skeel nor Weisel have any concerns about when they're being special summoned, but Grinnell has an effect that only works when it's normal summoned. Mechlord Army of Grinnell is an Earth Attribute Machine type level 4 with 1600 attack and 1200 defense. It gains 100 attack for each Mechlord monster on the field, except this card. When this card is normal summoned, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, half that target's attack until the end of this turn. The same as both Weisel and Skeel, it does gain an additional boost for other Mechlords on the field, so it can become up to 1800 attack. Its condition is based on only being normal summoned, which is why I explained why it's a bit of a problem if you're using it through the effect of Skeel or through one of the other support cards. Unfortunately, it is only a half the target's attack for until the end of the turn when it's normal summoned. It's not really that useful, and probably one of the weaker ones when you consider that with Gale the Whirlwind, it can half that opponent's monster's attack points indefinitely, well, for as long as that monster is on the field, and it can continue to use that effect on that same monster if you want to. The same could be argued for Armoured Bee, which is similar to how Grinnell works, but you can do it once per turn rather than it just being a once it's summoned once per turn type of effect, which probably out of the three makes this card the weakest. The Resolute Mechlord Army is a continuous spell card with the effect all attack position Mechlord Army monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle, also their effects are negated. So this just provides them with battle protection, which is fine, but it shuts down their effects, which means their attack points are going to be lower, and they're not going to be able to search using their effects either. It is a bit of a weird card to be adding to the archetype, considering what you're trying to do here is separate the Mechlord Army, which is a sub-archetype from the Mechlord Emperors. It would have made more sense to try and fuse the parts of the deck together rather than split them apart. Bird of Paradise Lost is a Dark Attribute Worm type tuna monster. It's level 8 with 2700 attack and 1500 defense. Its effect is this card gains 100 attack and defense for each tuna monster in your graveyard. Once per turn, you can send one tuna monster from your hand to the graveyard, then target one monster your opponent controls, take control of it until the end phase. So this card is actually really decent. It's very bizarre that it's supported by tuna monsters and itself is a tuna monster. And it's definitely weird typing in that it's also a worm monster rather than maybe a dragon, or as it perhaps suggests from the name, why it's not a winged beast, I couldn't tell you. The attack and defense gain is very minimal. If you've got a lot of tuner monsters in your graveyard anyway, that's fine. You could get this over 3,000 attack quite easily just by having 4 tuners in the graveyard. And the whole benefit is the more monsters that are tuners that you pitch to steal your opponent's monsters, the more powerful this card becomes. Whilst this is a once per turn effect, you can actually just steal an opponent's monster, maybe then summon one of your other tuner monsters and then use that to synchro summon. So the whole point is to kind of extend your combos whilst preventing your opponent from getting back control of those monsters. It's a good way of sending any obstacles that your opponent has on the field versus, say, using cards such as Destruction, which will maybe trigger off their effects. Chain Resonator is a light attribute fiend type tuner monster. It's a level 1 with 100 attack and 100 defense. Its effect is when this card is normal summoned, while the synchro monster is on the field, you can special summon one Resonator monster from your deck, except Chain Resonator. Again, this is another one of those Resonator monsters. It's one of the more modern ones, which lets you then go into maybe one of your level 3 Resonators. I think Dark Resonator is one of the key examples, the original Resonator if you will, and then go into your Red Nova Dragon through this effect. Red Nova is a fire attribute fairy type tuner monster. It's a level 1 with 0 attack and 0 defense. Its effect is if a level 8 or higher dragon synchro monster is on the field, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only special summon Red Nova once per turn this way. If this card is sent to the graveyard for a synchro summon that uses 2 or more tuner monsters as material, you can special summon one Fire Fiend monster from your deck in defense position. So what this card does is it actually just replaces itself with another Fire Attribute Fiend type monster. You probably have a few of those that Jack Atlas uses. I can't think of any of them quite right now. I think some of the Resonators meet this condition. They're all Fiend types, but they do have different attributes amongst them. Red Nova was originally the spirit, the devil creature Jack Atlas had to face. And this is like a somewhere link between that and his Red Dragon Archfiend. Double Tool C&D is an equip card with the effect equip only to a Power Tool Dragon or level 4 or higher machine type Morphtronic monster you control. While equipped, during your turn it gains 1000 attack. If it attacks, any effects of the attack target that activate or apply on the field are negated during that battle phase. During your opponent's turn, your opponent cannot select a monster other than the equipped monster as an attack target. An opponent's monster that battles the equipped monster is destroyed at the end of the damage step. So this card is the one I was mentioning before, which is quite powerful with Morphtronic Boomboxing. The ability to increase your monster's attack points by 1000 isn't bad, especially when you can turn off other effects when you attack a specific target. Being able to do that means that anything that activates can't do so. It doesn't work against any already activated effects, which is a shame, but you can't have it too overpowered. It does also have the benefit of focusing your opponent's attacks on the equipped monster with double tool C&D, because that means that if you've got it equipped to your Power Tool Dragon, at worst case, if it would be destroyed by battle, you could just rip this card away, or one of your other equipped cards, because of Power Tool Dragon's effect. Or potentially, if you've got something else, maybe it's not that big of a deal if you lose that monster. Drill Warrior is an Earth Attribute Warrior type Synchro monster. It's a level 6 with 2400 attack and 2000 defense. It requires Drill Synchron and one or more non-tuner monsters to summon it. And the effect, once per turn during your main phase, 1, you can halve this card's attack, and if you do, it can attack your opponent directly this turn. Once per turn, you can discard one card, and if you do, banish this card. During your next standby phase, special summon this card, banished by this effect, then add one monster from your graveyard to your hand. So the good thing about this card is it's able to direct attack. Whilst it does half the attack, 1200 points of damage isn't bad, and it might be enough to defeat your opponent. The other thing is, if your opponent happens to try and get rid of this card, by being able to discard a card, you can just banish this before that effect can activate, and then you get this card back with the ability to recover a monster that was sent to the graveyard back to the hand. So if you've discarded a monster to use this effect, you aren't really using or having any costs. Resonant Destruction is a continuous spell card with the effect each time a Resonator monster is sent to the graveyard as a synchro material, Target one card your opponent controls, destroy that target, destroy this card during your second end phase after activation. So this is actually quite decent if you're using multiple Resonator monsters to synchro summon, then potentially you're able to use this effect multiple times within the same turn. It does have the disadvantage of only lasting for a couple of turns after being activated, but I don't think you could expect too much, especially if you're synchro summoning that many times, because typically they will go into this Red Rising Dragon, then you'll go into your Red Dragon Archfiend, then you'll go into your either Red Nova Dragon or one of the other Red Dragon Archfiend based cards such as Tyrant, or I'm sure there's a couple of other examples out there. Means you can destroy several cards whilst this card is activated, so you're getting more than your bargain's worth for it. It reminds me a little bit of Power Draw, which is a card which can be used to equip onto a machine type monster, and that also has a limited activation effect for several turns, otherwise you end up drawing into far too many cards. And the final rare card is Force Resonator. This is a water attribute fiend type tuner monster. It's a level 2 with 500 attack and 500 defense. The effect: you can send this face-up card you control to the graveyard, then target one face-up monster you control. If it attacks this turn, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects that target a monster until the end of the damage step. This card is very useful, less so for it being a tuner monster and more so for its effect. Whilst it can be used to synchro summon much the same as any of the other Resonators, it's a lot more decent for using it with your Red Dragon Archfiend, which doesn't have that inbuilt protection, not the same as Red Nova Dragon, or one of the other variations such as Tyrant, which don't have that level of protection. It's fine as an effect, and it's a decent enough card to be used, but I don't think most players tend to put this card in. They would prefer to use things like Chain Resonator, or Crimson Resonator, or even Red Resonator, something that will extend your combos and special summon far greater than perhaps this card just normal summoning itself. I think the rare cards are quite useful in this set, and definitely nothing I can really underestimate as being particularly useless. I think double tool C&D is quite good for machines in general, and actually it doesn't have to just be for specific cards or decks. It can be just for the machine type as well. It doesn't have to be power tool dragon orientated. That's the best thing about it. Looking at the new cards which are introduced within Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, the mini box, the King of Vermillion. Turtlebird is a level 6 water attribute aqua type monster with 1900 attack and 1700 defense. It's a normal monster, so it doesn't have an effect, and considering it's a level 6 with that stat lineup, you've got level 4s that can actually beat this card. It's one of those pack fillers. Armored Starfish is a water attribute aqua type level 4 with 850 attack and 1400 defense. It's a normal monster, so it's just another one of those pack fillers. It's a decent looking card, but it's not really worth running, unless, for example, we get a deck based on Rescue Rabbit. Ominous Fortune Telling is a continuous trap card with the effect: during your standby phase, select one random card from your opponent's hand. Call the type of card monster, spell, or trap. If you call it right, you inflict 700 points of damage to your opponent's life points. You can only use this effect once per turn. Whilst this is a decent effect and it's one that activates during each turn, it does only half the 350 points of damage, and there is the chance that you guess wrong. It's also taking up one of the precious zones that you have on your spell and trap zone, and of course you'll only have a maximum of 3. So it's really something that you have to balance alongside what other cards are you going to use to either protect this card, or at least protect you from getting OTK'd, or from your opponent dominating against you. Fiend Scorpion is an Earth attribute insect type level 2 with 900 attack and 200 defense. It's a normal monster, and so it's just one of these pack fillers. It was used within Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. It did have a little bit of a cameo, and it was when they reached this sand dune dimension. It was being controlled under the power of Yugioh and under the power of the rock spirit to summon these fiend scorpions to kind of drown this submarine that they've got in the middle of the sand, which had a medical kit that Jaden and his friends needed to protect the other members of Duel Academy. Full Salvo is a normal trap card with the effect, when this card resolves, send your entire hand to the graveyard, inflict 200 damage to your opponent for each card you sent to the graveyard by this effect. It's a useless effect, it really only does 100 points of damage per card, and sending the cards you could do a maximum of say 500, 600 points of damage. It's really only useful within Callan Kessler's archetype for the Infernities, as they work on this handless combo, using the effects of monsters either in the graveyard or ones that you happen to draw on your next turn. Summon those, and then you can top deck in a certain way to use their full effect. Morphtronic Datatron is a fire attribute pyro type level 3 with 1200 attack and 600 defense. Its effect is, while in attack position, once per turn you contribute one monster to inflict 600 damage to your opponent. While in defense position, once per turn, you can inflict 300 damage to your opponent. This was first seen within episode 13 of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. I think it was a duel between Leo and Yusei when Yusei had lost his memory after being chased by, I think it was Officer Tetsu Trudge, and he ended up having a bit of a crash and losing his memory as a result. In this practice duel they had together, Leo used Morphtronic Datatron's attack position effect to be able to tribute tokens, which I think is actually perfectly fine. You can do that to do the 600 points of damage to the opponent. And he had 2 of the Morphtronic Magnon, so he could protect himself from ever being attacked. It also has the benefit, if you just aren't willing to tribute monsters, to be able to constantly do that 300 points of damage. Remember, in both of these effects, they're halved, so it's 300 and 150 damage to the opponent. It just depends on where you are within your situation. If you want more monsters in your graveyard, the best effect is the attack position one. If you don't want to overspend your resources, maybe having this in defense and guaranteeing 150 points of damage might be the better option. Morphtronic Rusty Engine is an equipped spell card with the effect, equip only to a Morphtronic monster. If the equipped monster is destroyed, inflict damage to each player equal to its original attack. Depending on what you're using and running and what is being equipped, this could make a bit of a difference, especially if your opponent is on low life points. But for the most part, it's a little bit of annoying damage that's going mutually to both you and your opponents. It's a little bit like Ring of Destruction without the so-called destruction effect. Ebon Arrow is a normal trap card with the effect, select one face-up monster you control. Until the end phase, it loses 500 attack, and during battle between that attacking monster and a defense position monster, whose defense is lower than the selected monster's attack, inflict the difference as battle damage to your opponent. When the selected monster destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard this turn, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the destroyed monster's original defense. I think I remember it actually appearing within one of the episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Crow faces up to, I think it's 3 security officers, and manages to pair this with one of his Blackwing monsters to do the piercing damage. Whilst this effect is quite decent, it does reduce your monster's attack by that 500, and depending on what you're running, that might make a bit of difference, especially depending on what your opponent's monster is. If they've got a very bulky defensive monster, then actually that will do a lot of damage. If not, then you might actually have wasted your time using this effect. It can be a hit and miss, but it's definitely something I wouldn't sit on. It's something that I might consider running myself. Black Thunder is a normal trap card with the effect, activate only when a Blackwing monster you control is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard. Inflict 400 damage to your opponent for each card your opponent controls. So this would only do half of that, which is 200. If they've got a lot of cards on the field, that's a maximum of 6, so that's 3 in the spell and trap zone and 3 monsters. That could be up to 1,200 points of damage. More realistically, you might be looking at maybe 600, 800 points of damage if they've got a couple of monsters and a couple of spell and trap cards. It's an okay effect, but really it can be forgotten within the archetype. Blackwing Etesian of 2 Swords is a dark attribute winged beast type monster, level 3 with 400 attack and 1600 defense. And its effect is, if a Blackwing monster you control battles an opponent's monster, and your opponent still controls that monster at the end of the damage step, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent. Again, this will only do 500 points of damage, which is fine, and it's very niche because it only has work if your Blackwing happens to have tried to attack into an opponent's monster and had not succeeded in that. For some reason, maybe it's not vulnerable to battle damage or to being destroyed by battle, but it's very niche circumstances. I would never consider running this card. Boon of the Mechlord Emperor is a normal spell card with the effect: if the only face-up monsters on the field are 2 Mechlord monsters, you can draw 2 cards. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. So this acts like a very specific pot of greed for the Mechlord Emperor deck, the archetype itself. It's fine as an ability and actually helps to thin out the deck, but it does come at the cost of your battle phase for that turn. Reboot is a normal spell card with the effect: shuffle 1 Mechlord monster from your hand into the deck, then target 1 Mechlord card in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. This just helps to recycle some of your Mechlord cards. It does shuffle the one from the hand back into the deck, but if it's one of the weaker ones, or one that's just not available or useful at that time, you can trade that in for something you've already used in the graveyard and recover it. Mechlord Factory is a normal trap card with the effect: when a Mechlord monster on the field is targeted for an attack, target 1 Mechlord army monster in your graveyard, add that target to your hand, then destroy the attacking monster. Destroy the attack target. So this actually swaps out your monster that's being chosen as the target for something that you can recover to your hand. That's not necessarily a good thing because that just means that your opponent can actually just attack you directly. Maybe it's better to just actually lose the monster than to have this happen. Unless, of course, you're trying to trigger the effect of Mechlord Emperor, which means that you can special summon that from your hand. Space Gate is a continuous trap card with the effect: each time a monster your opponent controls attacks or is attacked, place 1 gate counter on this card at the end of the damage step. During your main phase, you can send this card to the graveyard, special summon 1 monster from your hand, whose level is less than or equal to the number of gate counters on this card. This can be quite useful depending on what you're running. If it's something that doesn't have a normal summon effect, and that means you can just summon it and it's fine to meet this condition, that's okay. And it means that you're not having to go through the necessary tributes. My only concern is it does have to rely on a number of turns before you can get full effectiveness of it. For example, if you're trying to get a level 8 monster, that means you're going to have to wait until this has 8 gate counters. That means you're going to have to attack multiple times, or have your opponent attack multiple times, which will at least take 3 or 4 turns, in which time they might have gotten a strategy to either destroy this card or to actually deal with your hand, because they'll know from using this card what you're trying to do and to try and access. Morphtronic Engine is an equipped spell card with the effect: equip only to a level 3 Morphtronic monster. Its attack becomes double its original attack. During your second standby phase after this card's activation, destroy this card and take damage equal to the original attack of the equipped monster. I think most of the level 3 Morphtronics aren't particularly that powerful. I think the most is maybe 1,000 attack points, so doubling its attack to 2,000 might be okay for a time being, but it comes at a decent cost, and perhaps this is one of the worst equipped spells that you can actually have within their archetype. Morphtronic Force Field is a counter trap card with the effect: negate the activation of a spell or trap card that would destroy a face-up Morphtronic monster you control and destroy it. Add 1 Morphtronic card from your deck to your hand. So this is a more specific version of a counter trap card for Morphtronics as an archetype, very similar to things like Solemn Judgment, but it's specifically for this archetype. And being able to then search for another Morphtronic card, it doesn't have to be a specific monster, it could be a spell or a trap card, so long as it's within the Morphtronic archetype, means you do have more flexibility with its activation. Drill Synchron is an Earth attribute machine type tuner monster. It's a level 3 with 800 attack and 300 defense. Its effect is: if a warrior type monster you control attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. Once per turn, when you inflict battle damage to your opponent with this effect, you can draw 1 card. I like the design of this card, and I know it's specific for summoning Drill Warrior because it does require this card as the tuner monster. It's also very decent as it splashes in with warrior type decks in general, provides them with some piercing battle damage, and if you manage to do this multiple times, then you're constantly being able to draw into new cards, rather than running more generic cards which might have some disadvantages to them. Creation Resonator is a wind attribute fiend type tuner monster. It's a level 3 with 800 attack and 600 defense. Its effect is if you control a level 8 or higher synchro monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. This is one of those few Resonator monsters that doesn't really have an effect to it. It's more that it can just special summon itself if you happen to have the Red Dragon Archfiend on the field already. Let's face it, even though it says level 8 or higher synchro monster, that's most likely the target you're going to have on the field, and it just helps you to get into your Red Nova Dragon that much simpler. Synchron Carrier is an Earth attribute machine type level 2 with 0 attack and 1000 defense. Its effect is, during your main phase, you can normal summon one Synchron monster in addition to your normal summon or set. You can only gain this effect once per turn. If another Synchron monster is sent to your graveyard as material for the Synchro summon of a warrior or machine Synchro monster, while you control this card, you can special summon one Synchro token. It's a machine type Earth attribute level 2 with 1000 attack and 0 defense. You can only use this effect of Synchron Carrier once per turn. So the whole point of this card is it's an extender for your synchro plays. It allows you to then go into an additional summon within the turn, which means you can actually either use this card or some other cards you might have had, such as Quillbot Hedgehog, to go into something like maybe a Junk Synchron or something else, and then you're able to then potentially synchro into another monster, because this will then generate an additional token. It's an okay card, but it's not my favourite. It's supplementary and it can be easily forgotten about considering the amount of support that UC has received recently. And the final card is Red Supremacy. This is a normal trap card with the effect: banish one Red Dragon Archfiend Synchro monster from your graveyard, then target one Red Dragon Archfiend Synchro monster you control. Its name becomes the banished monster's original name, and replace its effects with the banished monster's original effects. So what's good about this card is it actually works with some of the other Red Dragon Archfiend cards because they treat themselves as that whilst they're either on the field or in the graveyard, or sometimes both. Much the same as things like the Harpy Ladies and the Cyber Dragons, they have very similar types of effects. By doing this, you're hopefully then able to use one of their effects that might, for example, one of them reborns Resonator monsters, helping you to go into Red Nova Dragon. One of them's able to shut down some of your opponent's effects, so that's also quite useful. And there are other variations you could probably think of yourself. I like the design of this card, but do I think it's probably one of the more useful ones? Probably not. Out of the newer cards, I do like the design of them. My favourite card probably out of the list of those is probably either Ominous Fortune Telling or the Space Gate, because they do both have useful effects to them. Space Gate being able to summon a high-level monster from your hand at no real cost to you, and Ominous Fortune Telling for the ability to see what your opponent has in their hand and to potentially inflict some burn damage. The worst card I would say is probably Turtle Bird. It's a level 6 and it's a normal monster, so many of the monsters actually level 4 can beat that card. If you think of things like Goblin Elite Attack Force or some of the other Goblin cards as well, those can also meet that condition. Even things like Giant Orc, Indomitable Fighter Lele, I think, is also another card that can do that as well. So whichever ones are your favourite and least favourite, please put those down in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe for more daily Yu-Gi-Oh content.